Today what we're going to do is just sort of dive into what a brand is. We're going to kind of clarify it to make sure that we're all on the same page. And hopefully you'll find this really interesting. This is going to be for you if you work at an agency and you're working on client brands, so you want to sort of tighten up your understanding of what brand is and how to do brand strategy. But it's also for you if you own or manage a brand and you're just wanting to do the same. You really want to understand more about how to build better brand practices. Join this channel, connect with me, and we'll make sure that you're seen right. So last week we looked at defining what a brand is not, as I mentioned. My hope is today that we'll be able to crystallise really what it is. We spent some time digging into understanding how various definitions of brand have been used throughout history and the different phases of brand throughout history. One of the things that we talked about was this idea of many of those definitions weren't necessarily wrong, they were just more incomplete or misaligned to the actual core idea of who owns the brand. When looking at this particular subject, it becomes the linchpin of the conversation. Who is the owner of brand? Many of the definitions that we saw, such as brand as logo or identity system or brand as an idea, all had elements of truth within them, but ultimately the challenge was that the ownership was wrong. And the right idea behind brand is that brand isn't something that organisations actually own, instead it's something that the organisation has the opportunity to influence. When we as brand practitioners help clients to evolve the way that customers or audiences perceive them, we have many tools at our disposal to help. But brands essentially are subject to a great deal of individual interpretation, and at the core is emotion. One person's brand will be entirely different from another person's brand based upon their particular experience. Martin Neumeier talks about this with as much clarity as I've really heard. He's a great person to dive into on this subject as a guide, as he talks about brands as being emotional gut responses to a company, person, place, or organisation. So he says specifically this: a brand is a person's gut feeling about a product, service, or organisation. It exists in the heart and mind of the individual. Perception is at the heart of what a brand is, but where perception ultimately leads to is into the realm of trust. It becomes very similar to the way that we relate to other human beings and build relationships of trust with them within the context of relationship. Therefore, an organisation can positively build a brand by focusing on increasing trust. It also highlights that when an organisation breaks trust or does not act with integrity essentially being true to who they are and who they say they are, then the likelihood is that they will undermine that relationship with their customers' perceptions of them. This is important because unless you can create trust with a particular audience, they're unlikely to want to invest in resources into you as a brand. Be that time, money, or typically emotional energy and attention. This is where some of the other subjects we talked about last time have an impact. For example, the misunderstanding of brand as an idea or promise can be useful as a lens to look at this subject with. The issue is not to make sure that you don't misunderstand either of these as brand, but rather just to use them in their appropriate way. For example, if you make a promise to a customer, don't break it by delivering a bad experience. This will only act to undermine trust. The result will be a negative perception. They are trusting something that they expect you to deliver on. Although promise might not necessarily be essentially what a brand is, and its own right become sort of a foundation for defining brand, rather it becomes a tool that we can use to build relationships with your customer. Trust is confidence in the honesty or integrity of a person or thing. So one of the previous agencies that I worked at was called Edelman. They used to produce an annual report on the state of global trust called the Global Trust Barometer. It looked at essentially how brands are going about building trust with their audiences in the 4 pillars of our society, being that political, business, media, and NGOs or charities. In their effort to define trust, they say this: trust defines an organisation's licence to operate, lead and succeed. Trust is the foundation that allows an organisation to take a responsible risk, and if it makes mistakes, to rebound from them. This equation is a simple one, but hopefully it encapsulates what we're trying to say. Brand strength equals positive trust plus positive perceptions, trust being licence, perceptions being meaning, equals brand strength. So we can see that building a strong brand in your audience's mind depends upon this trust. When you have a brand that elicits trust from its audience, you can start to create a virtuous cycle that kind of builds a strong relationship with your audience. But we can also see that the opposite is true. Firstly, a company may not be able to build trust because it struggles to get the attention that it needs to build the relationship of trust in the first place. Or secondly, maybe that company does something that undermines the foundational basis of their confidence with their audience. They are damaging their audience perceptions of them. Think, for example, of BP and the deepwater spill crisis that happened on the West Coast. They essentially eroded their trust, and the impact for them was that it really just financially devastated them. Beyond that of the legal damages and cleanup costs, this breakdown in trust continues to have a massive impact upon their brand, from which they have never really fully recovered, especially in the States. This quote from Investing News outlines the financial implications of this breakdown of trust for this global brand. Not surprisingly, the spill coincided with one of the biggest drops in BP's share price since 1978. The company's share price lost 54% of the NYSE between April 20 and June 25, 2010, bouncing sort of slightly back before the wellhead was capped in July 15, 2010. So that we can see that trust and perception are heavily linked to company success, which shows that every interaction that your company has with their audience, either trust is being established or it's being undermined. There is really no neutral activity when it comes to building brands. So what does this mean for you? The question is really, how are you building bonds of trust that you have with your particular audience? Are you creating trust or not? It is important to remember that it's not simply about how you can build the greatest resonance with your audience by shouting the loudest or so on and so forth. As a way of getting attention, not all attention is good attention. You have to have the integrity that supports trust on an ongoing basis. An actual factor of sort of building trust is not just about the simple delivery of services rendered for money paid. It's about a kind of cultural alignment as well. We can see that trust isn't just about that integrity, but it's also about, as you would do in a kind of a human relationship, you find people that you like. You connect with them and you enjoy their company because they're like you, and as a result you trust them and build relationship with them. So there's this other side of building brands and building trust with your audiences that isn't necessarily about just delivering on promises. It's broader and it's bigger than that. It's about resonating with your audiences and sharing their ideals, their values, their worldview, their aesthetic. Therefore, as an organisation, you will need to define who you are focused on and be super clear about it, because every culture is different, every audience will be different, and that second part of building trust in terms of building likability, building affiliation and building relationship that's not just based on kind of those more traditional bonds of trust needs to also be established, and that can only happen by focusing in on who it is that you're talking to, finding out who they are and ensuring that you connect. Even if you're serving sort of coffee or designing clothes, you need to do that through a cultural filter. You approach the market and your audience with more importance than sort of the delivery of the coffee and the clothes in itself and how you deliver on that particular promise. It's about the culture. So, in conclusion, building trust with your audience is multifaceted and goes beyond the delivery simply of a promise. Trust is critical, and that is why building brands is a subtle, sophisticated art that requires you to understand audiences at a profoundly deep level. And so my recommendation to you as you move forward So not only deliver on promises, which is critical as we've heard from BP, but also just think through how it is that you resonate with audiences on the area of likability, how it is that you connect with your audiences by being like-minded, of sharing their values and being trustworthy in that sense. Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to connecting with you next week, where we're going to talk about perception and what perception is. So perception is a word that gets bandied around all over the place, especially in branding. And it's really important for us in this conversation to really spend the time and refine what it is and how it works so that you can start building those positive perceptions with your audience. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.